Throughout history, individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities have faced exclusion from many spheres of public and private life, including schools and community spaces. People with disabilities have had to battle against decades of biased assumptions, harmful stereotypes, and irrational fears. The stigmatization of disability has resulted in the social and economic marginalization of generations of Americans with disabilities. So while most people think of the civil rights movement in the U.S. centering around racial segregation, discrimination, and the disenfranchisement of African Americans and women, many don't consider the disability rights movement, intersectionality, or how these issues persist today. Despite this, the story of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities is, in many ways, a story of triumph, of resiliency, bravery, and fierce determination to be seen as individual, person first, disability notwithstanding. Though the journey has not been easy, people with disabilities have continued to fight for their rights, dignity, and place in society. Today, as we celebrate all that has been accomplished in our community, we pay homage to the 5 families who banded together, not content to sit idly by as the world oppressed and excluded their children, but instead were determined to create a world where all people are valued, respected, and given the opportunity to thrive. A world where disabled does not mean disqualified. Their bold vision to empower people with intellectual and developmental disabilities took shape in January of 1963 with the incorporation of what we know today as Ardmore Enterprises. For 60 years, Ardmore has stood as a testament to the power of being in community together.
Be free one day. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
By the 1960s, the civil rights movement began to take shape, and disability advocates saw the opportunity to join forces alongside other minority groups to demand equal treatment, access, and opportunity for people with disabilities. This era is often referred to as the Disability Revolution.
I want to see a feisty group of disabled people all around the world. I mean, a group of people who will not accept no without asking why. That's really what's so critical about CIL, is that, you know, it's not a card that you get handed at the door, but it is kind of a demand that is expected of people in this community. And that is, if you don't respect yourself and if you don't demand what you believe in for yourself, you're not going to get it.
Many disability rights activists drew inspiration from the civil rights movement, and the two movements shared many similarities in their goals and their tactics. At Ardmore, the founders recognized the need for community-based services that would support children with disabilities who were not being served by the public school system.
So in 1963, when children did not receive services in the school, and Ardmore was born, right? And it was born because there needed to be a place for kids to learn and interact with one another and have social lives. And so Ardmore created it.
The folks that we supported that were school age were folks that the schools, PG County schools, were choosing not to serve because they were not toilet trained or because they had behavioral issues.
So Ardmore's start was because there was a need. And there was a need for opportunities, education, community, socialization for children with disabilities and families.
Ardmore began a small daycare center in a church basement. But its impact soon grew beyond the walls of that humble space. As Ardmore grew and evolved, it remained committed to empowering people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and advocating for their rights and inclusion in society.
As a person with a disability is one of the most important things that's coming out of what's happening here today. And to see hundreds of people with disabilities rolling, signing, using canes, the more severely retarded people for the first time joining us in this incredible struggle is one that leads me to believe that we're going to win this.
The 1970s was a decade of great political and social strides for the disability rights movement, with several major developments occurring, resulting in crucial advances in disability rights advocacy. One of the most important moments in the disability rights movement was the 1977 sit-in led by disability rights activist Judy Heumann and Ed Roberts. The sit-in was a response to the government's refusal to implement Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act.
We will no longer allow the government to oppress disabled individuals. We want the law enforced. We want no more segregation. We will accept no more discussion of segregation. And I would appreciate it if you would stop shaking your head in agreement when I don't think you understand what we are talking about.
In 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was passed to guarantee equal access to public education for children with disabilities. This act of legislation specified that every child had a right to education and mandated the full inclusion of children with disabilities in mainstream education classes. With the passing of this legislation, it was time for Ardmore to shift their attention towards access and care for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities.
As children were then allowed to go to school and had opportunities to learn within the public schools, Ardmore evolved and they started serving people with adults with disabilities.
So that's when we stopped doing the preschool. The school-age folks all had to go to the school system, and the only exemption they made are folks that were between 18 and 21.
In the 1980s, the disability rights movement continued to gain momentum, and advocates shifted their focus towards the deinstitutionalization of people with disabilities. For decades, people with disabilities had been institutionalized in large state-run facilities that were often understaffed, underfunded, and rife with abuse and neglect. Now, as state institutions continued to close across the country, the need for other settings for people with disabilities grew.
I'm extremely saddened at the conditions that people face within the walls of the state institutions that failed to meet their most basic needs of the people that they intended to serve, but instead created a place of inhumane treatment, including extreme physical and emotional abuse, financial exploitation, inadequate health care, and extreme seclusion.
Institutions were closing. The policies came about to close the institutions before services were developed in the community to support people to live in the community. So providers needed to come together and act quickly to figure out what those services look like and create them. And Ardmore did that. They bought homes, they created group homes, they started the services.
Some of the stories of the folks that you got out of Kraussel when you got their histories, you saw, even if they had an intellectual impairment, some of them had some serious mental illness.
Ardmore recognized the need for community-based services that would support disabled adults who were not being served by existing programs. Ardmore shifted their focus towards providing vocational training, employment opportunities, and independent living support to adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Ardmore's focus on community-based services was a significant achievement in the disability rights movement, and it paved the way for greater inclusion and independence for people with disabilities in the Prince George's County community. The passing of the ADA was a pivotal moment in disability history. However, the initial passing of the bill was stalled due to issues around transportation. In response, a group of individuals with disabilities headed for the Capitol. They tossed aside their wheelchairs, walkers, and crutches and descended the steps. This event has since been known as the Capitol Crawl. By dragging themselves up the stairs, these protesters expressed their daily struggles due to physical barriers. In doing so, they highlighted the need for accessibility. After decades of campaigning and lobbying, the Americans with Disabilities Act ADA was passed in 1990, and it ensured that people with disabilities would have equal treatment and equal access to employment opportunities and to public accommodations.
Even after the signing of the ADA, there continue to be barriers for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, including limited accessibility, inadequate educational opportunities, poverty, inadequate assistive technology, and many more.
So while the ADA is really critical and was instrumental, it focuses on the physical inclusion of people with disabilities. It has not actually addressed the issue of making our communities accessible to people with cognitive disabilities. And that is where we are today.
A spark was lit during this time period within Ardmore. Another shift began to take place where community involvement was not only wanted, but needed. Finally, we were seeing people with disabilities where others were, in churches, supermarkets, and watching baseball games. This was considered the time of physical inclusion. People with disabilities were now able to access more places in the community, though full acceptance was still growing. In the early 2000s, Ardmore recognized the importance of becoming more integrated within the community. Their services grew to include home supports, job development, employment services, and activities to promote community engagement and contribution.
What I can tell you is that Ardmore's support of employing people with disabilities, that ongoing support that they get throughout the support process, is really helpful and beneficial to the person receiving the support.
I believe that it is critically important for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities to have opportunities to work. Work leads to economic mobility, independence, stability, and opportunities for a better quality of life, and everybody wants that. Employers are always looking for a reliable and dedicated workforce, and this demographic provides them with just that.
They love their job, they love being there. You're going to have a successful employee. And as soon as an employer realizes that, that helps to build the experiences of employment for other people with disabilities.
I think that we need to communicate and educate. I think the workplace needs to be educated on the vast potential of this demographic and how it really can lead to better outcomes for the workplace in general.
And I think it just gives you a sense of purpose, because that's what employment does for some people, and many of us actually.
Today, disability rights advocates do not just work to make sure the ADA is enforced. They bring attention to issues that people with disabilities face and continue toward advancing the equal rights of people with disabilities. Inclusion of all people isn't a one-person responsibility. It's everyone's responsibility because we are in community together. During the last 60 years, we have seen what an inclusive community truly looks like and what a tremendous impact it can have on each person, regardless of level of ability.
Happy 60th anniversary, Ardmore Enterprises. Mwah.
Ardmore, happy 60th anniversary, and here's to many more.
Happy 60th anniversary, Ardmore!
As we celebrate Ardmore's 60th anniversary and the accomplishments of the disability rights movement, let us remember that the fight for inclusion and equality is ongoing. Let us continue to work towards creating a world where all people are valued, respected, and given the opportunity to thrive. Together, we can make a difference and create a more just and inclusive society for all.